All right, let's dive into the American South before the Civil War. We're going to unpack its incredibly complex and, frankly, deeply unequal social structure. It's a story of unbelievable wealth, of really tough poverty, and the powerful, kind of strange ideas that held the whole thing together. So let's get into it. Okay, let's kick things off with a stat that's pretty hard to wrap your head around. Right before the Civil War, nearly two-thirds of all the men in America who were worth $100,000 or more lived in the South. And yeah, you guessed it, they were almost all slave owners. This tiny group wasn't just rich, they were, by far, the wealthiest elite in the entire country.
But, and this is the absolute key, that incredible wealth wasn't spread around at all. Nope, it was concentrated in the hands of just about 3,000 planter families. That's it. This created a society with just massive inequality, and not just between black and white people, but within white society itself.
So, for our first section here, let's really get into these extremes. We're going to look at the huge gap that separated the super rich from, well, pretty much everyone else. So picture this. On one end of the spectrum, you have this planter class living in just incredible luxury. And on the other end, you have millions of other white Southerners, yeoman farmers, tenants without any property, who are actually some of the poorest people in the whole country. The richest and some of the poorest all living right next to each other. It's pretty wild. But things get even more complicated when you start looking inside that tiny group of the super wealthy. Because they weren't all one big happy family. There was a huge split between what we'd call old money and new money, and they created two totally different cultures of power. So on one side, you had the traditional gentry of the Old South. Think of places like Virginia and the Carolinas. This was the old money, right? Built on tobacco and rice. They built these gigantic mansions, they tried to act like European aristocrats, and they made a big public show of being these benevolent father figures. But on the other side, you had these upstart capitalists in the new Cotton Belt in states like Alabama and Mississippi. They cared way less about fancy manners and way more about one thing, making a profit, no matter what it took. And this quote from a Mississippi planter really says it all. Now, he uses the offensive language of the time, but it perfectly captures that new money mindset. He wrote, "Everything has to give way to large crops of cotton. Enslaved black people must work, hot or cold." See, there's no talk of being a kind patriarch there. It's just a brutal bottom-line business. And to squeeze out every last drop of profit, these guys perfected this really brutal innovation, the gang labor system. So instead of giving people individual tasks, they organized enslaved people into disciplined teams or gangs. They were forced to work at a crazy pace from sunup to sundown. It was like a factory assembly line, but the product was cotton, and the machinery was human beings. Now, all this talk about the planter elite might give you a certain picture of the South, but it really brings us to a huge question. How many white Southerners actually owned slaves? And the answer, honestly, it surprises a lot of people. In 1860, a full 3/4, that's 75%, of all white families in the South owned no slaves at all. The entire slave-owning class was a distinct minority. So if 75% of white Southerners didn't own slaves, then who were they? Well, in this next section, we're going to take a much closer look at this so-called silent majority and figure out their place in this really unequal society. And get this, even inside that 25% minority of families who did own slaves, the power and the wealth were still incredibly concentrated at the very top. It was not an evenly distributed group by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, just look at the numbers. They're pretty stark. The true planter elite, the ones owning 20 or more enslaved people, made up just 5% of the white population. 5%. Yet this tiny, tiny group owned over half of all enslaved people and grew half of the South's entire cotton crop. The vast majority of slaveholders were much smaller farmers who owned just a few people. So what about everyone else? Well, about 40% of the white population owned no property at all. They worked as tenant farmers or day laborers. One person at the time said they had no legal right nor interest in the soil. And since the rich elite didn't want to pay taxes for public schools, these folks had almost no way to get ahead. And here's the kicker. They were legally required to serve on the slave patrols, basically acting as a police force to protect the very system that was keeping them poor. And this brings us to the central puzzle of the Old South. It's the big question. If this system was so clearly holding back the vast majority of white people, why did they defend it so fiercely?
Why would they be willing to fight and die to keep an institution going that mostly just made a tiny elite super rich?
Well, the answer isn't really about economics. It's about ideas. It's about psychology. So in our final section, we're going to look at the powerful arguments they use to justify a totally unjust system, not just to the rest of the world, but to the very people who were being hurt by it.
The planter elite basically crafted this multi-part defense strategy. They completely stopped calling slavery a necessary evil and started aggressively arguing that it was a positive good. They pushed this deeply racist ideology that Africans were an inferior race who needed the guidance of white people, that argued that the Bible was on their side. And, as we said, they tried to paint themselves as these kind, fatherly figures just caring for their workers.
But their most powerful argument, the one that really worked, wasn't for outsiders. It was aimed right at their poor, non-slaveholding white neighbors. A South Carolina planter named James Henry Hammond put it perfectly when he said this. Think about what he's really saying there. He's saying, look, you may not have any land, you may not have any money, but you are white. In a society that's built on racial slavery, every single white man, no matter how poor he was automatically on a higher social level. He was part of the ruling race. And that offered this powerful psychological status that had nothing to do with economics. So when you boil it all down, the social order of the Old South was a pyramid. It was built on a brutal economic reality, sure, but the glue holding it all together was a powerful idea, the promise of racial superiority. It was a promise made to the white majority to convince them to defend a system that gave them very little economic hope, all in exchange for the psychological benefit of being a free man in a country of the enslaved. It's a really sobering reminder of just how powerful ideas can be in shaping who has power and who doesn't.